My name is Michael Sansorino. I am the Associate Executive Director of the Radio Television Digital News Association. And tonight it is my privilege to introduce our keynote, CNN Senior Crime and Justice Correspondent Shimon Prokupecz. By now, you likely are all familiar with Shimon's outstanding work covering the elementary school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Shimon has covered some of the biggest criminal justice stories of the past decade, such as the Brooklyn subway shooting, the Buffalo supermarket shooting, the Oxford, Michigan school shooting, the George Floyd protests, the Mueller investigation, the Pulse nightclub shooting, and more. By the sound of it, we know many of these stories were horrific and tragic. They required a true professional to deliver the news to an anxious public and seek answers to some really challenging questions. In each of those instances, Shimon rose to the occasion. Thank you, Shimon, for your service to the public, and thank you for being a great example of what courageous journalism can do. And now it is my honor to welcome Shimon Prokupecz to the stage.
Well, thank you, Michael. That was more than I can ask for. And, so many people give me compliments now. It's very hard to handle because I just feel like I'm doing my job. And in many ways, I was talking to Dan about this and Michael, and thank you guys for having me, and to the RTDNA and the National Press Foundation. I think it's an honor for me to be here. And one of the hardest things for me is always to accept compliments on my work, because it's not why I do it. Uvalde has changed me completely. It has changed my career, it has changed my focus in the work that I do and the importance of what we all do in journalism. And it's completely changed everything for me. And I know in many ways I probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that work. And so I'm very thankful to be here, and I'm thankful to be able to talk to you guys, because I think what all of you do is so important. And certainly we at CNN and many of us on the national level couldn't do what we do if it wasn't for your newsrooms and your reporters, because in many ways how we find out about what's happening comes from the local stations. And then we mobilize and move, and in many ways it takes time for us to get to certain locations. And I know it's not until we see your reporting or we see what it is, that the information that you guys are providing, that we finally move. And so I think it's important. And the minute Michael reached out to me and asked me to come, I said, of course, I think it's important. My roots are in local news. I started at WABC a little late. I was 26 years old when I started at WABC. I was actually an intern at 25. I was still in college. And I was hired and after my internship, and it was the most remarkable experience of my life. And to be able to come here and talk to you was something that I really wanted to do, because I feel that in many ways you are the decision makers, right? You guys decide what is covered every night in your newsrooms. And crime is a big part of that. And that's why we're here. We're here to talk about crime and how do we cover crime. And of course, we can't forget that with crime comes policing. And how do we cover policing, which has become such an important part of the crime story? How are the police reacting to certain situations? And I think it's the greatest time to be a crime reporter. So much information is available that wasn't previously available for many years. And we are moving into an era where you have court documents and affidavits and things that we can access now that we couldn't access before quickly. Body camera footage, cell phone video from people on the street, surveillance video that is available to us to challenge the authorities, to challenge the police in what they tell us. And really, there's never been a more important time than now, because there's all these cracks in our society, and there's this mistrust, and there's this suspicion everywhere. And what we do is so important in trying to bring, we try as hard as we can to bring fair information. One of the most difficult things that I have always found is when covering crime or covering these stories is holding the police accountable. It's a difficult thing to do. It's hard to scrutinize them. They clearly don't like it. They make it difficult to do. And it certainly makes our jobs tough to do it. And certainly from my experience in Uvalde, it makes what we do so much more important. And the question is always, well, what is the best way to cover crime? What are the best practices? What's the just and right way? What is fair and what is important? And I know in my own newsroom, we have these discussions. In many ways, we talk about how are we covering this? Is it fair? Are we giving every side? Is this something that rises to the national level? And I know across newsrooms all across the country, there are those conversations that take place. And they are important conversations because the whole thing is that we have to be fair and we have to give every side. And we must put things into context. And we can't just take what the police tell us. And while I may live in one neighborhood, you know, the way someone may cover crime where I live is much different than maybe where some of you live and the communities you serve and the communities you cover. But there is one thing that I think is very universal in crime reporting, and that is how the police should behave. There's a process. There's a system in place, and that's universal. That is everywhere. We have a constitution, we have laws, and there are things that the police should be doing. From the investigations to the arrests, to the trials and the convictions or the acquittals, and how the system should work is all universal. Understanding that process and that system is what has proven vital for me in my reporting and in my career. It has certainly made my reporting better. It has allowed me to ask the right questions. Understanding what the police are supposed to do and understanding what the process is vital to what I do as a crime reporter. But the most important thing, I think, is that when I'm in a situation covering a certain story, when I'm trying to ask questions, and I am asking questions, and I'm not getting the right answers, something seems off. Something seems like it's outside this system. Something seems as though the police are not telling us the truth. And that is why I think for newsrooms all across the country, it's important to surround yourselves with people who understand this system, understand the process, understand how it's supposed to work. You know, throwing reporters into situations and, you know, I understand resources and I understand money, but sometimes throwing reporters into situations where they don't really understand the process or they don't understand the system, the police department and the officials take advantage of that. And they're not as honest as they should be. And then, of course, oftentimes what happens is when there is a crime story, I feel in many cases, the first account that we get as reporters, as journalists, come from the police, whether it's a public statement, a tweet, some information they may give your assignment editor who hears something on a scanner and is trying to find out what's going on here. And so that first piece of information that we get is going to come from the police official. And in many times what we find is that we're not getting the full story. It's misleading even in some cases. And of course, it's not going to contain the important facts. And then, in many cases, we rush to air with it. And we don't give ourselves an opportunity to try to make sure that what we're saying is right. And we'll say, well, you know, we'll say, police tell us, police say. And then later, we learn that the information could be different from what we were initially told and from what actually happened. And I think the best example of that, I mean, Uvalde is one thing, but certainly George Floyd. And you'll all recall that in the immediate aftermath in George Floyd, where the police initially told everyone in their statement that Floyd had physically resisted officers and appeared to be suffering from medical distress after being handcuffed. And of course, we know that wasn't the case. But many of the local stations ran with that. And that's understandable. But I think since George Floyd, we have all been trained in some ways to think differently about what the police tell us initially. And I think that, again, was very evident in Uvalde. But like George Floyd and Uvalde, for me, the question is always, how do you get to the truth? How do you peel back these layers, police officials who are telling you information, and find out what really happened? And I find that really the only way to do this is that you just have to keep pushing. You just have to keep pushing the officials to try and give you more information. And when you know, as a reporter, how systems are supposed to work, and when you are getting information that is off from that system, and police certainly are not answering simple questions like a timeline. Give me a timeline. And this is the thing in Uvalde. I kept going to them. Give me a timeline. Because what happens is, in every mass shooting now, and I think a lot of, like in Buffalo, I covered Buffalo, the police have become very good at knowing what we need to do our reporting, and they give you a timeline. And everything kind of makes sense, and things happen very quickly. That wasn't the case in Uvalde. And so there were so many questions about exactly what did the police do there. And so as fact finders, as journalists, it is our job to keep pushing, right? And to hold the police accountable to what it is they're claiming or what it is they're telling us. And I think also it means really, like we did here in Uvalde, is staying on a story. And I know you don't always have the resources to do that. But for some reporters, and keeping them on a story could be very beneficial for all of you. It was certainly beneficial for us in Uvalde. It may mean working weekends and long hours. It may mean telling your reporters, you know what, I'm not putting you on the air today. And that has happened to me at CNN. My boss would come in and say, we're not putting you on the air today. Go out there, figure out what's going on, come back with something, and we'll put you on the air. And sometimes you just have to do that. Because developing sources and information sometimes is more important than just being on television. And getting the details are so important. And that sometimes is the only way to do it. And that's what happened in Uvalde. Because what happens is the public statements that the police are putting out, and they had a PIO in Uvalde. He comes to the scene the morning after, and he provides us with all kinds of information. Because many of the police leaders were not speaking to us. So what happens is the public information officer, who is a police officer, instead was doing all the talking. And we couldn't get any of the bosses to talk to us and to give us an understanding of what really happened. And sometimes we never get the chance to talk to these bosses and to these leaders. And sometimes they tell us, well, we can't talk because there's an ongoing investigation. And that's fine, because none of us want to hurt any ongoing investigation. I certainly never want to report on something that's going to free a suspect or somehow allow a suspect to get away. And that's a serious consideration, because there are times as a reporter where sources are talking to you and they're giving you information, and you're like, okay, well, you're getting really ahead of yourself here, and you're putting the story ahead of really the investigation, and I can't go with this because this guy's gonna get away. It has happened to me. And so you have to make a decision, okay, I'm not gonna do this. I'm not gonna report this information. I don't want to hurt this investigation. But I find that a lot of police officials use that as a way to escape having to answer questions. And so when that happens, and certainly in stories where you feel like there needs to be some accountability from the police officials, the leaders of these law enforcement agencies. It falls on us, the reporters, with the direction from you, the news directors, the assistant news directors, the executive producers, to really push us and to really guide us and to really support us in making sure that we are chasing the information and holding people accountable, especially when they're trying to escape the accountability. And it's not easy. And I say this from experience, not only in Uvalde, but in other situations where I am having to confront people, the very same people in my life who have been sources to me throughout my career, having to confront them over information that they're giving me, which may not be accurate or which may be some kind of a spin, is certainly very difficult because I don't want, honestly, for me, it's something where I do not want to be in a position where they're angry at me over this. And so there's a way to deal with it is you just bring in other reporters or you bring in other people to help you to try and navigate that difficulty. But the hardest thing, I think, for reporters, especially young reporters, is when you think you have a source in some agency, and I certainly found this in Texas, and I find this in other places, and it's hard to hold people accountable who are providing you this information and who you are relying, they work for these agencies, they work for law enforcement, and they are the people that are providing you information. And then you have to challenge them, and it becomes very difficult. But I've learned one thing, is that when you challenge people and when you question them, it's strange, but they, especially in law enforcement, they actually respect you. And they know they can't sort of spin you and they can't play games with you anymore. Something very incredible happened to me in Uvalde because the Department of Public Safety for months wouldn't return my calls, wouldn't take my calls, wouldn't answer my questions. So one day, we found out where the director was going to be. And my team and I were in San Antonio. And we get word that the director, Steve McCraw, is going to be at some public hearing 6 hours away from San Antonio driving. And so I say to my team the night before, I said, guys, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to get up early and we're going to have to drive 6 hours to get Steve McCraw. And they're like, well, why? And so we had some documents that we needed to question him about. I never expected that I would have this opportunity to talk to him. So we get to this college that he's at. It's close to the border. He shows up, and we get him. Not only do we get him, we spend 40 minutes going back and forth. It was just an incredible moment. It was the day the Queen died, and so unfortunately, it didn't get a whole lot of airtime. So literally, we were in the car driving and listening to the coverage of the Queen, and we're like, what are we doing? Like, we're never going to get on air. But that wasn't the important thing. The important thing was to get him and to confront him and to ask him some questions, because no one had talked to him since. He could not believe we were there. He was shocked. Well, the DPS now returns every one of my phone calls, because I now know that I have the goods and I have what I need and I'm not going to stop. So much so that actually, McCraw will talk to me every time I see him. We have good conversations. He understands what I'm doing. But he developed this respect for me that I certainly didn't see coming. And the agency as a whole, which ignored my phone calls, I actually think they're not very kind to the press, and I think they could do a better job, started to return my phone calls and started to respect me because they knew I was armed with the goods, and they also saw that I would confront them. They saw that I wasn't going to stop, and there's nothing they could do about it. And so that was an important moment, because what happened there was McCraw told me that he would resign if any of his officers, law enforcement officials were found to be culpable. And it's a soundbite that we have used from time and time again, because actually 2 people now in his agency have been fired. But he's, of course, saying, well, I didn't say I would resign. If I would only resign if the agency as a whole was found culpable. So he's not resigning. But that soundbite was so important, and confronting him was so important, and just not letting him get away without giving us answers. And there was this incredible 40-minute exchange. And that was the respect that I gained, finally, from that agency. And it took that to get it. And as leaders in your newsroom, for me, the most important thing you can do for your reporters and your team is to encourage that kind of reporting, to support that kind of reporting, to support their curiosity, support them asking tough questions, and most importantly, make them know you have their back. Because asking the tough questions, especially in an open press conference where there are so many reporters there and cameras and networks are taking it live, it can be difficult. I know I find it difficult, and in the moments in Uvalde, I certainly found it difficult and I found it intimidating. But after those moments, getting a phone call from the boss, a text, all helped, because it showed that they had my back, and it showed that they were going to support me in what I was doing, and they felt it was important too. And that was important for me, and I know it was important for my team. The reporting process in Uvalde has been the most incredible experience, and probably, I always say when I go through these stories that I will never have moments like this again. I will never have opportunities like this again. And I think in many ways, how that came about was because of my curiosity and because of the support that I had from my bosses at CNN and putting together an important team. They gave me an incredible producer, an incredible writer and editor, and putting all of those things together have certainly made a difference and allowed me to be who I am as I searched for answers and searched for what really happened. My questioning of the police in Uvalde began almost immediately. I remember getting on a plane. I'd just gotten back from Buffalo. It was a couple of days after the Buffalo shooting. And Uvalde happens, and CNN calls me and says, okay, we need you to go. At that point, we learned 17 kids were dead. And I started calling sources, and I said, what's going on? And really, no one knew what was going on. But the little bits of information I was getting were raising all kinds of red flags for me because I knew something was wrong. I knew something wasn't making sense. And again, it was that timeline. I couldn't understand why everything took so long. Why did it take so long for the police to get inside that classroom? Why was this going on all day? It seemed like it was going on all day, and no one really knew. And then the next morning, of course, we get there, we drive, we get in, we don't sleep, and we go right to the live location, and we do our morning show, and then a Texas DPS public information officer decides that he's going to do media availability, and he's going to jump around from camera to camera and just talk. And finally, he came to CNN, and he came to our position, and it was me and John Berman, who was the anchor of which was what was New Day at the time. And we had a back and forth for 20 minutes with him. And I could sense that what he was saying wasn't making any sense. He was defending the police officers, as PIOs often do. That's their job. They're going to defend the officers. Well, you need to understand they were facing difficult situations. At that moment, it was so fresh. It was the next morning. Though I can sense that something wasn't making sense, I couldn't confront him on that yet. It was too early because it was about the families at that moment. The families were grieving, it was, to me, I felt the story was about the families at that moment, and we couldn't go after the police just yet, and we also needed more information. But I couldn't believe what he was doing. And every time a booker or someone, a producer from one of the shows would call this PIO, he would come and he would talk about it. And consistently just giving this bad information. And when you would ask him to make sense of it, he would just give you the same thing. Well, we were still looking at it, we're still investigating. But as a police officer, you should know what you're saying didn't make any sense. And he wouldn't respond. So then finally, after a couple of days of this, of him talking and talking and talking, they decide that they're going to have a press conference. And at that point, we're about two to 3 days into this, and we learned from the family members that they were outside of the school, and they were trying to get inside to rescue their kids, and the police officers weren't going in, and there was this perception that all these police officers were standing outside, and there was this emotion that really took over. And it was a really tough time for me, because you really got to see the families, and you really got to see the pain that they were going through. But what was really so difficult for me also was the dishonesty from the police. And they were dishonest. There were officers who were trying to hide what really happened. And at that point, when I heard that the DPS was going to have a press conference, I sort of was at the point where I felt like, okay, enough was enough. We were here. We were at this moment where it was just time. And they had that one press conference where it was a Thursday, and they revealed some new information. Well, we now believe that the gunman was not confronted by the police as he entered the school. And at that point, it was just gloves off, right? At that point, it was, okay, well, tell us what happened. And then they used this line, well, we're still investigating. Well, that was when I think I found my voice, quite honestly. And I felt the need to confront them and ask them why it is that they keep giving us bad information. And then the next day, Steve McCraw, my friend now from the DPS, held a press conference and admitted that the police screwed up and that the failures were horrific. And much of that, I feel, would not have happened if it wasn't just me, but other reporters pushing and pushing and pushing to make them finally come out and tell us the truth. It was certainly not something I expected to hear from the leading law enforcement official in Texas, to stand there and tell us that the officers did nothing as kids were inside this classroom. It was an important moment in the story. It was important for the families and the community who have been trying so hard for so long to get answers about what happened. And they finally had some answers, but it wasn't the complete story. And of course, we all know a lot has changed since that. And that final press conference will be the final time that they would talk, that the Texas DPS and law enforcement officials would talk. And it would have been very easy for us, for CNN, to say, okay, well, the story's kind of over now. Let's pack up, head home. It was Memorial Weekend. A lot of the networks were pulling out. But there was a decision made by us at CNN and our, who was fairly new at the time, Chris Lick, to stay on the story. And we had a 9 a.m. editorial call, and he said, we need to stay on this story because this is exactly what they want. They want us to leave, and we're not leaving. And so with that, and that support from the boss, we continued. And our team continued, and because of that, it opened so many doors for us and gave us access to information that I truly believe is just unprecedented. The scope of which no one will ever know because I will never talk about it. But what we have seen and what we have learned during our reporting is worse than anyone can imagine. The videos, the statements from some of these officers, how they're trying to explain themselves, it was shocking to me. And of course, through our reporting, it led to some stunning developments. A school police force was suspended, people were fired, and now there are other investigations. And of course, if it wasn't for that support from our boss and from the bosses at CNN to say, stay on this story, I'm not sure any of that would have happened. Great reporting, like Uvalde, like other stories, has a tremendous effect on people's lives. That community, the families, it has affected them, and they find some hope in the work that we as journalists do. It's not only me, it's other journalists, the local reporters there who are out there every day talking to the family members. They are so appreciative of what we are doing. And they are appreciative that we are holding people accountable. And we've been doing that for 8 months. And the power that we as journalists have to get answers for grieving families is enormous. I've never felt anything like this before doing this job. And it's been the most rewarding experience of my life, and made me prouder than ever to be a journalist. And I'm so happy to do what I do now, because I really finally feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And just to kind of, I don't know how many of you know anything about me, but journalism kind of started for me late in my life. I was 26, which I think is late for this business, 25, 26. I did an internship. I was still in college. I was working, and I did an internship at WABC. I was going to part-time college, and then I was working actually in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. And I kind of just needed something different in my life. And I did an internship at WABC, and I spent a year in the investigative unit. And it was the most, rewarding and incredible experience. And those are my roots. I came from local news. After my internship, the news director at the time, who was Kenny Plotnick, hired me. And I worked on weekends on the assignment desk. And of course, crime, certainly during that time, was what led our newscasts every night. I'd sit at the desk, on the assignment desk, listening to the scanner. Something popped up, made my phone call. Okay, this sounds like a story. Let's go, let's move. And that became the lead story Saturday night, and then whatever else happened on Sunday night. And much of that work was really exciting. I loved being an assignment editor and making those decisions and moving crews and figuring out what was a story. And I was happy to be able to work in news. I wanted to go to law school at one point in my life, but I knew that coming out of law school, the loans were just going to be enormous, and I couldn't afford it. So I chose instead to stick with journalism because I felt that I could do the work that I wanted to do in journalism. And I felt that the student loans would just be too much for me to handle, and that I just needed to work. And so that work at WABC on the assignment desk opened enormous doors for me. I then went and worked at ABC News for about a year on the assignment desk. Not my favorite job. So, it was a lot of national and international news, and I felt like I needed to go back to my roots in local news. And so then I was hired at WNBC. And there I worked with a great reporter by the name of Jonathan Dean, so I think is one of the best crime reporters in the country. And his skill at breaking news and getting scoops is really unparalleled. And I learned so much, and we were reporting partners in many ways. And then I wound up, after that, about 5 years, just needed a change. And CNN called me, and they said, well, we want to move you to DC, pair you up with our justice correspondent, and have you work here. And that's how I wind up at CNN. But all these experiences for me in covering crime stories, I felt that crime was one of the most important stories that journalists cover. Victims are hurting, family has lost a loved one. Being sympathetic to those family members, having compassion and being considerate of their needs, to me has always been important. And we are a place for them to share what it is they're experiencing. We are a vehicle for them to get answers and to hold those in power accountable. And I think it's such an important thing that we should not forget. And we must always, and one thing that Uvalde taught me is that we must always consider how and what we say affects them. And is certain information necessary? Do we need to hear the gunshots of their kids being slaughtered in the classrooms? Do we need to show the gunman or report his name? These are serious considerations that I think news leaders need to make. What is the value in that? And the desires and wishes of victims need to be front and center and need to be prioritized. It was a big thing in Uvalde. When the video came out from the hallway and those gunshots, family members were furious. And they called me and they said, please don't air it. And we didn't. We respected their wishes. They asked us, don't show the gunman in the hallway, and we didn't. Don't name him, and we didn't. It's important because they're going through a lot, and bringing them back to that moment, I realized anything that brings them back to that moment was just too painful. And I know in the next few days, I think a lot is going to be talked about in terms of nuance and reporting and how do you add nuance to certain stories. And I think it's important because nuance in many ways offers more explanations and it digs deeper into what exactly is going on in a community with a particular investigation, with a particular police department. And really for crime reporters, one of the best things that they can do is try to build relationships with sources. It's a key part of reporting. You guys want scoops from your reporters, right? You want to break news, you want to come up with an exclusive. But you have to give your reporters time to do that. We need time to build sources. We need to make an effort to build these relationships. And the thing I will say to you is that the encouragement that you can offer, especially young reporters, people who are just starting out in this business, and encourage them to do that, and encourage them to go out and meet with people, and encourage them to build relationships. Because in crime reporting, relationships, I mean, in any reporting, but in crime reporting, there's something very different. You know, when you're dealing with police officers and you're dealing with agencies, building those relationships are so important. And the other thing that I always find that with crime reporters and people who cover this for a living is the passion and how passionate they are about covering crime. And for you, I say find those people who are most passionate and give them the space to grow and give them the space to develop themselves. They may not be the person that you're looking for at that particular moment, but if they have a passion for something, don't ignore it. Appreciate it. It was important because I think in many ways that's how I wound up at CNN doing what I'm doing. Because I certainly never expected to be working at a place like CNN. I remember my news director at WNBC at the time when CNN called me and said, hey, we'd like to bring you over here. She told me, well, you have to go. You can't, I have nothing more to offer you here, and I think this is an amazing opportunity. It was a pay cut. It also would require me to move to Washington, D.C. And I was like, I'm not leaving New York. She encouraged me to go. And it changed my life. And covering crime has really been my life at CNN. They view me as kind of a subject matter expert. And my path at CNN really is unique. I was one of the first group of people they brought in and just threw on air. It didn't happen right away. It was a couple of years, but it's because I had great bosses who saw some potential in me. They saw that passion, and they said, okay, we're going to give you a chance. I didn't ask to go on air, but it just happened. And they have allowed me to pursue my passion. They have allowed me to go after these stories. And they have given me the space to pursue the passion and also tolerate a lot, because it's not always easy dealing with me. But, it's not easy dealing with reporters sometimes, especially people who build their careers on scoops and breaking news and getting to the story, which is my passion. It's stressful, it's hard work. But CNN gave me an unbelievable opportunity to do something I never dreamed of. And in many ways, what I lacked in experience, I didn't have the on-air experience. They didn't care. Go. You have the information, go on TV, go for it. And that passion really overcame the inexperience. The passion in pursuing information, in pursuing the truth. And after all, it's why we do what we do. So it's been an incredible 8 months for me, and I am so thankful for being here, and thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
Shimon, thank you for sharing your experience with us.
Of course.
I'll ask a couple questions of Shimon here, and then we'll open it up for your questions. But one thing you mentioned was the space and time you had to give to the victims' families and how you felt that. One thing we're going to talk about in a couple days is the mental toll covering crime, covering trauma has on reporters. How have you coped with the trauma that you faced in these many different stories you've had to cover?
The team, really. When you are done for the day, I have an incredible producer, Matthew Friedman, who has been spending a lot of time with me during the George Floyd unrest and many stories that we've been together now. So he's kind of, I wouldn't, it's kind of like my therapist, and he's kind of picked up on when I can start to lose myself on television. And, it's important to show that emotion, and there are times when I have, and we have systems in place kind of to deal with, okay, if you really feel like you're losing it, we have sound ready to toss to, and so we could take a moment. At night, we would spend some time together just talking. In Uvalde especially, we had 90-minute drive home at like midnight. And so we would spend some time, and most of that time was quiet time, and we would just sit there. And exercise is something that really helps me. I find that to be very helpful. But also just my bosses checking in on me, that really helped me. Sort of just, okay, are you okay? And they could tell when it was time to go home, and they'd say, go home, come back on Monday, go home for the weekend. And having that was really helpful. And I would talk to my friends about everything, but there are things that I just couldn't talk about. It's actually been much worse the last couple of months because of all the body camera footage that we have seen and how horrific it is. For us, and listening to the 911 calls of the kids who were calling. So it's really been the last few months that I think have been much more difficult. And it's hard because you're going and you're running. I mean, we were working, from 6 a.m. to midnight, and so you don't really have time for yourself. But now I'm starting to have time for myself, and I think you start to feel it at different moments, which is what I think is expected. But just talking to people and my colleagues and the bosses have been extremely helpful.
Yeah, I think, the bosses for you, we have lots of bosses here. Besides checking in, which is important, what are some other things that they have done to let you voice that and feel that, but let you kind of work through that while still maintaining your composure on air and your ability to ask questions and be involved in the story?
Well, the one good thing is they want the authentic, be who you are. And I think that has proven very valuable to me at CNN is be you, go, be who you are, giving me a lot of space. I will tell you the last 4 months since we've been really digging into Uvalde, we control what we do. No one is telling us what to do. We decide what stories we're doing. We decide when we're doing the stories, how we're doing the stories. And they've been incredibly supportive in that. And that has been very helpful as well. Mm-hmm. There's no pressure. That's what, I guess that's what I'm getting at. There's just no pressure. Do what you need to do and come back to us. And if you need a break, take a break. Mm-hmm. And that's been really, really good. But, I will say to you when, look, I'm doing what I'm doing because I enjoy it and it's important to me. But when the boss calls you, I had not had a relationship with Chris Licht until he started and I started reporting on this story. And just one night he called me and I was like, oh, hey, how are you? He's like, oh, well, how are you? And thank you for everything you're doing. And that meant a lot to me.
Do you have conversations with other reporters, not necessarily in Uvalde, but maybe your colleagues at CNN, about these challenges and what others are doing? I mean, is there a community there that helps support each other?
So I'm very close to Evan Perez, who's our justice correspondent in DC. He and I are like brothers and best friends. So he is someone that I lean on a lot because his understanding of law enforcement, having someone who understands what you're doing and what you're covering is very helpful. It's a peer who understands the difficulty of getting this information, who understands how hard it has been to put all of this together, how stressful it has been. I had one of the most stressful periods, and probably, I mean, in my career certainly, but maybe my life, is when we were about to report on that officer who left the DPS, the Department of Public Safety in Texas, was on scene on the day of the shooting, and somehow got hired by the school to be a police officer. When we put all that together, I mean, I was so stressed over it because I knew the minute we go to air with this, they were gonna fire her. And it was a serious thing to think that my reporting was going to lead to someone's life basically being torn apart. And that's a very serious thing to think about. And you want to be right and you want to make sure you have everything buttoned up. And when you're in Uvalde, the school district refused to talk to us. We brought everything to them, and we said, we're giving you an opportunity to do something about this before we go on air, and they wouldn't. And I couldn't believe it, and that, to me, was so stressful, that reporting.
Yeah. You mentioned during your speech the conflict between police and journalists. And I think, we all in this room can agree that it's grown to a point where we no longer have access to police communication in a lot of different cities. What are the biggest changes you've noticed since you started at CNN? And let's just start with there. What are some of the biggest changes you've noticed?
So I think clearly some police departments are much better at this than other police departments. And you look at, the only thing that I can think of right now is Buffalo. When I was in Buffalo, they came out, they had a press conference, they gave us the timeline. The FBI was there, the Buffalo police and the mayor. They knew what they were doing. They put it all together. They put the information out there. They knew what we needed. They asked, what do you need? What can we do for you? What information do you need? And they were pretty together. And, some of the other mass shootings, certainly the police departments have been better to come out and to give information and to put everything out there that they know at that moment. I do think where we're seeing some issues, I think it's some of the more local, smaller police departments. But I have to be honest with you, I don't cover the NYPD like I used to. But man, if I covered them like I used to, they would be in a lot of trouble because the stuff that's going on there is very troubling to me. And that department, I feel, right now is not doing a good job of communicating and giving information. I mean, there was the terror attack in Times Square, and they had a press conference overnight, and they never had another press conference after that. And no one, they made all these We learned that the FBI, this guy was on the FBI's radar. We learned all this information, but yet no one is running around to try to figure out what happened there. How did this happen? If he's on someone's radar and it's gone, I mean, that's it. And so I think if reporters are not holding officials accountable and police departments accountable, they're going to get away with this. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I don't know how that happens, how it is that they think that they can just not answer questions and not, they think that. It's very clear they didn't want to answer those questions.
Last question I have for you, then we'll open it up. The police-journalist relationship is at a point now, and it's in some ways it's healthy because journalists are asking tougher questions of police than they probably ever have before. In response, we're seeing police withhold. You mentioned in your speech showing up when no one else would, having the goods, and showing that you were invested was one way you were able to develop sources and get to stories. What are some other ways, without dialing back, right? Because I don't think anybody wants to be less critical or less curious. But what are some other ways where we can work through this conflict to keep our community safe? Because at the end of the day, I think journalists and police are after the same thing. So how do we get there while maintaining that professionalism on both sides? So
I think building relationships is certainly one of the things. I think reporters, are not given the space, I think, to build relationships, or in some situations they don't know how to do it. And I think it could be better if it's on both sides, because when I talk to police departments, I'll say to them, well, you need to get out and you need to get ahead of things and you need to build relationships with these reporters in these communities. But the problem is sometimes, like what I said, is like it's a very fine line, because you may be building these relationships with police officers, police officials, then they expect you to just do what they want you to do, and it doesn't work that way. So I think building relationships certainly is one of the things, but understanding, problem is also, understanding how, again, talk about the system and how the system works and how much it could help you as a reporter when you're covering a beat or when you're covering something, and understanding exactly how everything works will make it easier for you to have a relationship and communicate with some of these officials. And I don't know. Everyone reporters on their own have to decide how far they want to go in building relationships and where they want to go with building relationships with law enforcement. And some reporters just don't want to ever do it, and they feel like it's not appropriate for them to do it. And then you have some who love it and live for it and build these relationships with law enforcement. And I don't know what's better, But the point is, in all of this, is holding them accountable, right? And making sure that we're chasing people down that we need to chase, and make sure they're answering questions. Because when they think they can get away with it, they're going to get away with it. And I think that's what happened in some ways in Texas. The fact that I drove 6 hours to get this guy, he couldn't believe it. He was like, and that was important to do. It changed so much. So that's one of the things. Just keep fighting, right, and keep pushing, and eventually I think it comes. I really do. I'm amazed at everything we've been able to accomplish in Uvalde.
With that, we'd love to hear questions from everybody here. We got Mike here.
Janice Jin from Honolulu, Hawaii, from KITV.
Hello.
Wanted to say, first of all, thank you for your coverage.
Thanks.
Excellent job. But I worry for people like you, because I worried about the mental health
Sure.
that you've gone through in some serious situation here. So as managers in the newsroom, I'd like you address the question of what can we do as managers to keep you in the business, to keep you going? What was it that your manager did that kept you alive, if you will?
Space, trust, believing in me, listening to me. My boss said, she said to me, she goes, you were raising questions about this from the beginning. And I think hearing that from her showed she was paying attention, showed that she cared, showed that she was invested in what I was doing and believed in what I was doing, and allowing me to stay on this story has actually helped me a lot, because there's been some closure, and not just deciding, okay, well, we're gonna move you onto something else. No one at CNN has come to me and say, okay, well, we think it's time for you to start focusing on something else. Just keep going, keep doing what you're doing. So I think the space, the interest, the caring, a simple email really made a difference. And of course, we are offered help with anything that we need. But to be given the space, to take the time off that I needed if I wanted to take a day off. And they gave me an incredible team to work with. The help that I really needed, the producer and a copy editor. It was more for our digital stuff, Rachel Clark. It's just phenomenal. And it's just the three of us. It's just three of us working through all of this information that we have. And we also have a great photographer who's phenomenal and really involved. And I think having that team and keeping the team together as we are has been very helpful as well. But it's just the check-ins. Okay, how's everything today? Is there anything we can do for you? Do you need anything? And those little things really made a difference.
Hi, I'm Walter Smith-Randolph, investigative editor at Connecticut Public Broadcasting. So when we talk a lot about crime, what I hear, is, reporters need time. But a lot of us work in newsrooms where we need to feed the daily beast. And so you're a former assignment editor, so I think your perspective is unique. So how do you balance that? How do you make sure that you're giving reporters the time they need to dig deeper, to do these trend stories, but also make sure you're feeding the beast, staying relevant, and not getting scooped by the station across town?
I mean, not getting scooped is certainly a big concern was always a big concern for us in this story. And there were a couple of things that we did rush and we did push because we knew the Texas Tribune. We have Uvalde so wired that we knew what others were doing ahead of time. And so because we knew, we would sometimes push stuff ahead of the newspapers or other folks who were working on stuff. It's tough. I mean to feed, you have to decide when you have certain reporters, who are your reporters that are going to be the ones that are feeding the Daily Beast, and then who are the ones that you're going to really just say, okay, go chill, go figure out what's going on, and let's try to get something really great, and let's try to break something here, and let's try to develop something. I will tell you, and I didn't mention this earlier, but in Uvalde, what we did was we decided one weekend, early on, my producer and I, we decided that we're just going to go together to Uvalde. We're not going to bring any photographer with us. We weren't going to do anything because there was a health fair going on. And we didn't really know the community that well. And so what we did was we just, we told our bosses that we were going in, and they were like, okay. And we spent 2 days with family members just talking and learning about them and learning about their concerns. And really, as an outsider, learning about that community was so helpful. But it also built this trust that has been so important in this story. It's just put the camera down and spend time with these people. And not everything has to be a story. Like, I go and spend time with sources and I just hang out. And you have to give the space to reporters to do that. Or maybe it's a producer, or maybe it's an off-air reporter that you hire, and you say, you go do that. And you go and build these relationships so that we can use our on-air reporters. I mean, that's what I did as an off-air reporter. And so I would just feed whatever reporter was working on this story, what I knew. But I think you just have to decide who's going to be the reporter that's going to be feeding. And I understand the constraints of, TV newsrooms. I do. But, you know, it's really the only way I feel to really get to the heart of a story and to get, especially on very big stories. And I mean, I get the constraints. I mean, it kind of troubles me always because I saw a lot of it in Texas. And I think a lot of news directors and news leaders in Texas couldn't understand how this guy from New York City was coming in here, spent 2 months here, and got everything. I mean, I'm happy to talk about that, you know. Fact is, I felt that people felt that the local reporters were not as invested in the story. And I don't know that that's right, but I know the people who came to me with this information, they also, quite honestly, were worried about their relationships with the officials. And they're like, we don't know if we can trust. And that really scared me. How do you decide, like, well, you're not going to trust the reporters in your own community? I mean, and that's a problem.
Hi, I'm Melissa from the ABC affiliate in Spokane, Washington.
Hi.
Thank you for pushing, because it matters, so thank you. I think so much of what we don't report is as important as what we report, and you talked about that, the things that you will never report. How do you make that decision? What goes into that?
So is it one thing always, if it's a crime where there's victims, obviously, it's the family members, I ask them, do you want us reporting this? How would you feel if we reported this? There's a local newspaper reporter, and I think he also does some TV stuff in Texas. You know, in the Texas thing, they aired that video and they played the gunshots. I've never been in a situation where I've seen family members so angry. It hurt me to see them so angry because of something that a reporter did. And I don't know what value it brought to the story. You know, kids seeing a gunman or hearing gunshots, if it's going to trigger something in a victim or in a family member, don't do it. It doesn't matter. We at CNN overall don't have a policy of not naming mass shooters, but Anderson Cooper's show does have that policy. And that is a show that I do mostly. So that is just a policy that Anderson on his own decided. You know, there's a whole campaign by law enforcement and the FBI asking reporters not to name. And I think it's a good policy, and it's something that there's no reason. You know, of course, in the initial stages, you do need to report who the gunman is and whatever you know about him. But there's a way to do it where you don't need to always name him. It's really upsetting for families, especially in mass shootings. And there's other little details that you think of that are you going to be harming the victim? Are you going to be harming, it may be something that's a great piece of detail and that no one else has, but you have to decide sort of, is it going to hurt your credibility? And that's the thing, I think, mostly that we as reporters and news leaders need to decide. Is it going to hurt the credibility of our news organization? And that's what I worried about for CNN. And I have a lot of say in what we do. I'm thankful to that. The bosses they trust my judgment. And when the family members, because we were going to air those gunshots, and I was like, oh my God, we can't do it, because the family members are going to be really angry at us. And we have so much credibility with them that if we do this, we're going to lose all credibility with them and with that community. And so they said, okay, we won't do it.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Tim Sheld from the RTDNA, but also formerly of WCBS News Radio in New York City. So I feel your pain of the DCPI phone calls you would make when you were on the assignment desk. And my question is related to that. Michael brought it up. You know, at some point in time, the NYPD may go to encrypted radio so that you, as an assignment editor, might not even have access to hear what's happening in the biggest city in America. What would you recommend that we as news directors, we as advocates of open journalism How do we fight that?
Yeah, I don't think you can ultimately fight that because there's nothing that says that we're entitled to listen to these radio communications, right? The FBI is encrypted, Washington, D.C. is encrypted, and many police departments all across the country are now on encrypted radios. So there's nothing we can do about it. So I think one of the things that I think reporters and assignment editors in D.C. do is I think the fire department is on and unencrypted, and so sometimes they get information like that. The thing that's going to happen is, and then like the NYPD, is that the DCPI is going to have to be, the press office is going to have to be more proactive. Good luck, right? I don't know. I mean, like, we're not going to be able to chase things the way we used to. And then you probably have to rely on stringers in some ways. I think the stringers in New York City, I relied on them a lot, who were very helpful in telling us where to go and what was going on. So that may be an option. But man, that's going to be a tough time because especially in New York City, I mean, listening to those scanners and chasing the news, and I think in every market it's like that, but some markets don't have it. And I don't know, I'm really curious to see what they do. But maybe the fire department.
We have time for one more.
Scott Diener from St. Louis. You did a really nice job on your report. I think I was the only one watching you when Queen Elizabeth died on that stuff. But the question I have for you is, we talk about holding public officials accountable who are elected. And I'm wondering if Governor Abbott has been held accountable enough in that case.
Governor Abbott? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question because, so he was on with CNN Today, actually. I think it was the first time in probably a very long time. He was on with Jake Tapper today, and Jake asked him about Uvalde and specifically about Steve McCraw, the head of, my buddy, the head of DPS, whether or not he was standing behind him. And it's interesting because Abbott is not very direct about whether or not he's going to continue to support him. And every time he's been asked that question, the thing I will say to you about, I have tried to find Governor Abbott, and maybe I haven't tried hard enough, but I've not been able to figure out where he is. During my time in Uvalde and running around and wanting to try to get him, I couldn't figure out where he was going to be, because it's like, I'm not sure they put out a public schedule. And again, what else was really amazing to me in watching this, and I'm not trying to knock people down, but I found that the local reporters were not really pushing him on it. And I don't know, I don't know. I'm very new to that market, but I did find it interesting that he really wasn't being pressed on any of the issues. And I don't know if he's just not telling reporters where he is, if they're choosing which reporters are going to come to their press availabilities. But no, I think we need to know more about his thinking, and we need to know more about what he was doing that day and what he knew. Because of course, he's blaming, well, I got bad information. But I do feel that we need more from the governor.
Shimon, thank you so much
All right,
for
thanks,
your
guys. I appreciate
time
it.
and expertise.
This was great. Thank you.